Hello, friends of the paranormal. This is your co-host, Stu, and I'm here with the paranormalist, Patty Wilson. Patty, how are you this blustery, cold, snowy, nasty January day?
Well, it is definitely blustery because we've got about 6 inches of snow out there and they're calling for a few inches more over here in these mountains. So, 'cause I live in the Appalachian Mountains, as you know, and well, we're muddling through. I'm tucked away nice and warm with my kitty cats in my little camper, and I'm all happy.
Yeah, we have just about, the last time I looked, 4 to 5, somewhere around there, but it's tapering off. So as soon as we're done here, I get to get bundled up and go out and take care of things, which
Oh, aren't you a lucky pup?
I think I mentioned before, I get really depressed at this time of year. I hate the
Yeah.
cold. I hate the snow. Something that you wouldn't hear someone say in the state of Pennsylvania, but that's how it is. So anyway, I would like to thank all of you for putting up with this. We missed a couple of weeks, but we're back. If you would be so kind, if you haven't already, click subscribe, click the like, click the bell to be notified when we release new content. That's on YouTube. And everything else is in the description below. I'm going to leave it at that. So, what is our topic for today?
Oh, it's A Winter's Tale, Ghost Stories in the Snow. It
A
was
gr- yeah, great. Yeah.
it was so apropos. I couldn't help it.
Oh my. All right. Well,
And I have to tell you, somebody had jogged my memory about a story. So I guess about 3 years ago now, I was living in a town in Bedford County, and um, somebody had come to stay, and they were a smoker, and they were staying for the weekend. And this person, a friend of mine who was a gentleman, um, was staying with my family and I. And when he would go, I don't let anybody, I never have left people smoke in my home. So every time he wanted to smoke, he'd have to go out, and he was very much like you in that he didn't like the winter and the cold. So he would bundle up and get in his car, put the radio on, turn it on, and like warm it up and sit out there and smoke for a little while, and stuff like that. And so the first night he was there, uh, he was he was fine, and he's one of those people that would get up in the middle of the night and smoke. I personally don't think I would want to do that. So anyway, the first night I noticed he got up around 2:30. You notice the door clicking shut and stuff like that because we're not used to it happening in the middle of the night.
hmm
And he went out, and he took about half an hour, and he came back in. And so the second night when he went out, I didn't think anything of it. I figured, okay, he just went out to smoke. And again, it was the middle of the night, 2:30 in the morning, and it was bitter cold, just blustery, bitter cold. You have the wind blowing the snow and it's skittering across the streets and that whole thing, and the bushes are all dead and they're rattling like bones, and the quintessential night. And it was very full moon though. And it was that bright moon that even's brighter because it's bouncing off the snow.
Right. Yep. hmm
So, um, I just kind of rolled over and thought, well, I know my son was there, and he would go out and make sure the door was locked because he's very cautious, shall we say. So all of a sudden I hear this door come open a couple minutes later, and he comes in, and he's making a lot of noise. Like he's really not even attempting to be quiet, and he kind of bumps across the furniture and trips over something, and he comes back through the dining room and back through the kitchen and back to my bedroom in the other end of the house. And he he knocks on the door, and he's like, "Are you awake?" And I'm awake now.
Yeah. Obviously. Yeah.
So I turn on the light and I said, "Are you okay?" And he steps into the room, and he's like, I don't know what I just, and he's like stuttering like that. I don't know what I just saw. And I'm like, "What do you mean? What did you just see?" And I'm trying to figure this out because, like, I can't think of anything in this nice little quaint town that's going to rattle you that bad. Like, there's nobody up in the middle of the night in this town. You will see a deer coming across somebody's yard and a few stray cats. That would be it. And he's really shaken, and he says, "You're not going to believe me. but I'm sitting there and I got the radio on, and I'm smoking my cigarette. I got the window open just a little bit. And now my house sat on a road, like it was on the upside of going up a hill. And then you would go down the other side and it would take you out of town. And he's sitting there and he's kind of facing the hill. And he said a man came walking over the top of the hill in the middle of the night, all bunched up, like huddled in, and not a really big man. And he said he had something like a coat, like fluttering around him, and I could just see him in silhouette, and the street lights were, causing that silhouette effect. And he's like, I'm watching him and I'm thinking, dude, I wouldn't want to be you. Why are you walking in the middle of the night and what have you? And he's like, as he starts walking closer, I start to realize there's things about his clothes that are recognizable, and he hits a street light, and he said, I realize he's in Confederate clothes. And I'm like, Confederate clothes? Like, I mean, we're like, I don't know, 50 miles from Gettysburg, maybe. And he's like, I know that sounds insane, but he's got a kepi on. He's got a coat, a gray coat, and he's got it pulled around, and there's like a cape over the thing, and he's got the gray pants, and he's like, he's Confederate uniform. And I have to tell you, there is absolutely positively no reason on earth that anybody would want to be dressed in a Confederate uniform walking in the middle of the night in like January, February type weather in this little town. There is a event in the summer at a local museum where they do have some reenactors, but it's in July. So he's watching this guy, and this guy comes down past him, doesn't seem to notice him at all. And as he gets closer, he gets into the dark because there's no street light right at my house. And he veers off into the yard in between the two houses. There's I don't know, maybe a 20-foot, 30-foot walkway between the two houses. And it's that way between each house along the street. And my friend gets out and starts to follow, thinking, what are you doing going into their backyard? And he said, I walked into the darkness and out to the other side at the back of the yard, there is a street light. And so he watched the man walk 3 or 4 steps into where the light was and disappear. And that's when he came running into the house. And so it was interesting. And I said, well, to the best of my knowledge, the Confederates hadn't made it this far. This is a town that's very old. It's from the 1780s and 1770s and 1780s. So it would have been in existence at the time of the battles of Gettysburg and the Civil War. But I would have expected if it was somebody who maybe had come from the town, they would have been a Union soldier. Later on, about a year later, a man in this region releases a book about the Confederates having come to this town. And it was a little known story.
Yeah, Bedford's only, 20, 25 miles from the Mason-Dixon line.
Yeah, we're not far at all, maybe 20 miles. Like we're literally half an hour from the Mason-Dixon line. So, but it's too far west for it to, I mean, I know that they made it to Bedford County in that up on Broomba Mountain, there's that place where they have the breakaway where they were trying to set soldiers there. So if they made it that far onto the Broomba Mountain, they could shoot at them and keep them from going. And they made it into Blair County. I knew that, but I didn't know that there had been any in our town, but apparently there had. So I can only wonder what he saw that night. And it kind of got me thinking about ghost stories and the dead of night and cold of winter and all of this. And so I keyed it into my handy little, I have an index, and up came a whole pile of stories I've told. So the next story I wanted to share is a story about a little girl named Condi Cunningham. She was born in December of 1891. Records vary slightly. She was 16 or 17, depending on the record you read. And even the death certificate has a little tiny bit of mystery to it, but most likely a typo. I'm not going to make a big deal out of it. I'll explain it when we get there. So she was born in Jefferson County in the town of Birmingham in Alabama. The story is that she was at the Alabama Girls Industrial School. It's now the University of Montevallo. And so it was a women's school. And on the night of February the 4th of 1908, Condi Cunningham and a couple of her girlfriends, 3 or 4 of her girlfriends, gathered in her room, and they had what they called an alcohol. It was an alcohol stove. It was a little tiny stove, kind of like a little chafing stove, and you would set it up and you could heat something on it. And they were heating milk to make hot chocolate. And they weren't allowed to have them because they were dangerous. But it was cold and the girls were having a good time. They were all sitting on Condi's bed and they made their little hot chocolate. We don't know how it started, but one of the girls knocked the little heater over while it was still lit, and it fell on Condi's feet, caught her nightgown ablaze, caught the bed ablaze.
Oh,
The other girls jumped off the bed. Condi ran past them, not realizing that what she was doing was fanning the flames, ran down the hallway, screaming for help, and she collapsed at the end of the hallway, badly burned. People brought blankets and they managed to get the flames out and what have you, but she was in really bad shape. She survived for 2 days and then passed away. It was just a horrible tragedy, but it was more than that. So after Condi's funeral and what have you, the mess was cleaned up, the bedding in the room was cleaned and the beds were changed, and all of this stuff happens and life goes on, except for 2 or 3 days after Condi's death. The girls begin to see what looks like to all of the world how the wood grains in the door began to restructure themselves to look like Condi's face, and there's like flames and she's yelling, like you can see the screams. And at first the school was like, somebody's playing a lousy joke. It's just a really lousy joke. They're drawing it on or something. But it wasn't. They looked in and sure enough, it wasn't. So because it was so creepy, they took the door off and put another door on. And that door was put into storage. And within a couple weeks, this new door proceeded to have that same etching. This is not the first time I've ever heard of this phenomena. I know many ghost stories where this has happened. This went on for quite a while. Now, this was, Condi's room was on the 4th floor of the residential hall. And people began talking about hearing her screams like they were the night of her death, or the burning, and hearing footsteps, somebody screaming, "Help me, help me." The dean began to get really antsy, thought somebody was playing a terrible joke, actually went to the place and stayed in one of the rooms unbeknownst to the girls, heard it herself, and went out into the hall. There was nobody there. And they could never pin it on anybody. And as years went by, this happened over and over. They eventually shut Condi's room up and they no longer used it for quite a while, figuring that in time the stories would die down, over time. However, after about 7 or 8 years, they decided to put the room back in use. There hadn't been any stories. Nobody had seen and heard anything for quite a while. So the story had died down, and it was long enough that the students who knew the story had all passed on, and those who had heard the story had kind of all trickled through the school, and it was easier. So the girl who was sent to that room, God love her. So she wakes up in the middle of the night and there's this flaming ghost of a teenage girl in a nightgown, and she breaks through the doorway and runs down the hallway, and the stories all come back again. So eventually the room was taken and just left open. The door was removed and it's just a storage area now. But even today, there are girls who claim that they hear the running of feet down the hallway, somebody yelling, that kind of stuff. And so I wanted to see if this legend had any teeth. And I'll be doggone if it doesn't have a lot of teeth. So unlike a lot of these stories that that you don't, they're like you can't pin the people. Connie Cunningham was a real person. When you went to find a grave, they took me right to her grave. They have photographs of, I don't know which of the girls it is, but there's photographs of the graduating of the class of those girls, the first year of the class of those girls that would eventually graduate that were Condi's friends and classmates. And she's in that somewhere. There's nobody seems to know which one is her, but it exists and it has the name of the school, the date, the whole 9 yards. There's all kinds of documentation in Historical Society all over the place for this woman to have existed. I've got photos of her grave. She was a real person. This is a real story. And this story has followed this college for a long, long time. And I just thought it was an interesting story.
Me too.
And so now the next one is really bizarre. Insanely bizarre. So this is in Germany. There's a place called the Schloss Ronen.
Castle.
Ronen?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Castle. It's a castle,
Mm-hmm.
yes.
Yep.
And it sits literally at the top of a mountain. And you only have one way up to it. And it is at one time was considered one of the most haunted places in the world. And the reason it was that it was considered that is that it had so many stories. So a doctor bought it in the 1920s. And he was going to live there, and he began to have problems with hauntings. And these were not like apparitions coming out of a wall, disappearing down a hallway, or anything like that. These were insane stories. So he contacts a priest, and he says, I think I need your help. This castle is really haunted, and I live here, and I need assistance. So he brings this local priest in, and he says, can you just like exorcise the ghosts, get rid of them, make them go away? And now these stories are based upon the notes from the priest who wrote a journal of his experiences there. So the doctor took possession of the place in September of 1921, and the priest was brought there approximately 2 months later. That's about all he could take. And the story of the first encounter was this. The priest and this man are standing on the second floor of the castle. They're looking out the window. It's late at night, and they notice a light in the courtyard. It just sort of materialized out of nowhere. And the light begins to grow until it's the size of a human being. And it walks around the courtyard, this lit, illuminated man with a pale yellow face. And the two men see it. The priest throws open the window, and he, according to his journal, and he said, is there anything we can do to help you? Do you need assistance to find rest? Ghost doesn't answer them, although it must have heard them because it looked up at them. And then it lays down with its arms stretched out as though it were laying in a grave. And this went on for almost 5 minutes laying there. And the priest got the impression that it was mourning over a grave. And then the entity rises up, and there's a house nearby, like a caretaker's house, and it's called the Hunter's House. And this entity goes into that house, and that's when the noise breaks. It just sounds like somebody's throwing all the furniture in this building. The doctor grabs a flashlight, and he runs over there because it sounds like they're tearing the house to pieces. The priest comes with him, and the furniture is there, but everything's just scattered. Like it's tipped and turned and topsy-turvy. And they can't explain what's going on. Eventually, they return to the second floor. This noise continues for an hour and a half. And they just sit there waiting for it to go away, and eventually it does. Now, over the next 3 or 4 days, this continues. The next evening, they see the light, but now it's 2 lights in the courtyard. And these 2 men show up. These men don't lay on the ground or do anything. They ignore the priest, and they go straight into the Hunter's house, and again, all kinds of noises and what have you. And this went on for a substantial period of time, well over an hour, and then silence. The third night, 6 lights appear. And again, the same thing. And but these entities seem to be communicating amongst themselves. They see their mouths moving and they're gesticulating as though they're talking. Not a sound comes out. And then they move toward the hunter's house, and there's obviously a clear authority. There's one entity that the others bow to and let him pass before them, and then he goes into hunter's house, then they follow in, almost, out of respect. And this time the priest is ready. Like, he had been kind of thrown off. He had never heard anything quite like this. So he's got all his Latin exorcism, mass things going, and he's got holy water and the whole 9 yards, and he runs over with the doctor to the hunter's house, throws open the door, and the entities are standing inside the door. Like, they're in that open entry area. And 2 of the ghosts bow to him and look at the priest as though, what are you doing here? Why are you interfering with whatever it is we're doing? And all of a sudden, firewood comes flying out of the little stack on the beside it, and things are starting to go crazy inside. And this sound that the priest relates it to the sound of an old coffin lid being opened. I don't know how he knew that, but that's what he uses as reference point. And he said 4 of the ghosts came out of the hunter's house in solemn procession. They seemed to be bewildered, walking back and forth and discussing this situation amongst themselves, but not a sound was heard. Now the priest is pretty rattled, but he says, he yells out to them, if I can be of service to you and bring you peace, please tell me so. And the lights, like the entities, begin to glow stronger. And then the fifth ghost joins the 4 that are outside. And he says, do you want me to make a mass for you? And the ghosts intensify their light even further. And the entire courtyard is lit up by these 5 entities. And so then they blink out into nothingness. So the next day, the priest goes to his church and does 5 masses, 1 for each of these men. And he thinks that he's managed to get the whole thing taken care of. But that night, there's heavy boots, there's knocking on doors, windows, furniture being thrown around in the main house now. And then there's these newcomers that are ghosts. These ones are not so nice. They speak out loud and communicate quite freely with the priest. They curse him out. They call him names. They say horrible things to him, but there's still a couple that are very polite. And they will do things when the priest asks them. Like he said, there was one night, there was one that was there, and it said to one of the men that the doctor knew who had come to witness all of this, and it said, if I were you, I would get rid of your housekeeper because she steals from you. And then just disappeared. Well, the man went home and checked it out, and sure enough, it was true. And they offered other information to other people who came, but nobody would sleep in the castle the whole night because it just couldn't. And then all of a sudden, crazy things like bones and skulls of human beings, like they were coming out of thin air and falling on the tables, falling on the floors, and they were very old looking. They would gather them up and put them in a bundle and take them out to like an out kitchen area or someplace to have the priest dispose of them. And 5 or 6 minutes later, they'd be back in there, even though everybody was still in the room and nobody had left the room to go and fetch them. And this went on and on. They said that the evil ghosts would make the porcelain break. They would stain the clothes, making them smell bad. And once they were stained, you couldn't wash the smell out. That a black hand would be seen knocking on the windows, and you couldn't see anything but the hand. And eventually the priest gave up. And at one point, according to the spirits that talked, there were 56 entities on the property.
Wow.
And they said to the doctor, to the priest when he would come back and forth, and to others who were there at different times, that even though they're vile and they speak ill, all of these entities have come here because we need you to help us cross over. And throughout that period of time, the doctor, that priest, a couple other people began that process, and they actually eventually did. And most interesting of all, the one who named himself as Mac Rolhassan, who was the knight of Geraldsek, who had lived at the castle in 1312. And he said the reason he was at the castle still is because he had committed 7 murders in his lifetime, and that he was supposed to continue haunting 900 years, but that the priest's prayers and requiems had shortened his period considerably, and that he thanked the priest for helping him to find peace. And after all of this happens in the 20s and it goes all the way into the early 30s, they finally almost all go away. There are some little tiny stories of like footsteps going along or something moving, but like normal classic ghost story stuff, this is poltergeist material. And it went on for over 10 years. And that's how it got the reputation of being the most haunted castle in Germany. And one can see why.
Interesting about 700 years. That was, yeah, that's,
Yeah.
you said he had to stay there for 700 years. That's oddly specific.
Like a penance. If they were Catholic, they would believe there was purgatory or a penance or different things. So, but yeah, it's a fascinating story. And as I was going through it, I was like, wow. And this all began in the winter of 1921, and it would pick up in the fall and winter every year, get worse. And this continued on for, like I said, over a decade. It's a really bizarre story. It reminds me very much of like the Bell Witch and stuff like that, where this was beyond anything we normally think of. They talked, they spoke out of the air, they walked into the room and had conversations and then disappeared. I can't imagine that kind of a haunting.
Different.
It is very different. And like I said, it isn't completely without precedent in the annals of paranormal, but we would call it more of a poltergeist activity today. So my next story I wanted to share, bear with me a second, I want to give the appropriate credit to the person to whom it belongs. There was a gentleman by the name of Jim Santos. There was a website that put out a thing asking for the most interesting winter ghost stories. And this particular gentleman shared this story, and I wanted to share it as well, but I wanted to make sure that you all knew that this is somebody else's story, and I wanted to give him credit. So this gentleman says that when he was 25 years old, he worked as a cable TV contractor. Basically, he would bid on jobs and go install internet, and cable and crap like that in people's homes. And, he made some pretty good money overall. He said he was a religious guy, and he had a habit of, when he would get stressed out or whatever while he's working, in his head, he would recite the Lord's Prayer, just under his breath to himself. Nobody else knew, but it kept him focused. It was just a habit of his. So he's in the mountains of Santa Cruz, and it's the middle of the winter, and he's picked up this job to go put cable TV in the cabin of these 2 older ladies who are sisters. And he's like, it wasn't a big paying job or anything like that, but it was my job. So I went and I did it. And I get there, and they're very nice ladies with this little quaint home, this little log cabin. And they're like, we just want to be able to watch TV in the living room. Could you just put one in there? That's all we want. And he's like, sure, not a problem. So he's working on it, and he's like stringing the cable and getting everything ready. And the ladies had left him to do his job in the living room, and they went to the kitchen. He can hear them milling around talking and, whatever they're doing out there in the kitchen. And he's kind of grateful, to be honest with you, because it's easier to not have people talking to you while you're trying to make sure you got all the little bits and pieces right. You know what I'm saying?
Yes, I do.
I'm sure you do, because I know you've had that experience. And he's kind of mumbling the Lord's Prayer under his breath, and he looks up because he felt like he wasn't by himself. And he said there was this man standing at the other end of the living room, and he assumed that's where the bedrooms and the bathroom and all that would have been. There were four rooms back there, one being the bathroom and what looked like three bedrooms. So he says to the man, "Is there something I can do for you?" And he said, "The man looks like he's glaring at me, and he's like, we're maybe 20 feet apart." And the man just kind of staring at him like with a nasty look. And he said, "Is there anything I can do for you?" And the man points at the one bedroom and he said, "Do you want cable in your bedroom while I'm here?" "I can do that. I'm already here." And the man just like looks at him again and very disrespectful, and turns around and walks into the bedroom and slams the door. And he's like, "Well, you're a jerk. Like you didn't even say anything. You could have just said, 'Hey, I'm sorry, I didn't know you were in here,' or whatever." Instead, so he's like, "I'm kind of rattled a little, feel like," and his word is asshole. He said, "I just in my head, I'm thinking, what an asshole. Why couldn't you have just been nice and said, 'I'm sorry, I didn't know you were here,' or whatever?" And he said, "I go ahead and I finish doing this, and I bring the ladies in. I'm like showing them how to run the little, devices and all of this." And he said, hey, I just wanted to let you know that the old guy that lives in the other bedroom, what seemed a little upset about me being here. If he's upset, I apologize. I really didn't say anything to him other than ask him if he wanted to have cable in his bedroom, and he got mad and slammed the door on me." And they're like, "What?" They're looking at each other like, "What are you talking about?" And he goes, the guy that lives in the bedroom back there." And they're like, "What guy?" And he's like, "The guy that lives in the bedroom back there." And now he's getting a little aggravated because he's thinking that they're like playing with him. And he's like, "I'm telling you, there's a guy in the bedroom back there." They're shaking their head like, "No, no, no, there's not." And he walks over and he points to the door. He's like, "This door." And the ladies go, "There's nobody in that room. There's nothing in that room. It's an empty room. We just cleaned it out. It used to be storage." And he's like, "No, seriously, he's in that room. He couldn't have come past me." So he opens the door and the ladies are like, "What are you're crazy or what?" And he's like, "No." And he looks in the room and there's nobody in the room. And he goes, "Where did he go?" And they're like, "There's nobody in the room. There's no closet. There's no nothing." He goes, "He went out the window." And he goes to try the window. And the one lady says, "Sir, that window's been painted shut for 20 years. We don't use this room." And he said, it was just the craziest thing he had ever seen in his whole life. This man. And he's like, "I don't know to this day who he was, where he came from." The ladies had never seen him. Nobody, nobody had ever heard of this. It wasn't like they knew the house was haunted. He's like, "I have no clue." But he's like, I somehow have a feeling that me sitting there saying the Lord's Prayer under my breath agitated and aggravated him enough that he came out to glare at me.
You think that somebody would have heard a door slamming too, but
Yeah, and like they didn't hear anything. He heard it. He
Mhm.
was perfectly sure that, that it was real. Like this guy didn't look ghostly. He was solid, appeared real in every way, just didn't make any sense. And it really rattled him. So that was his story. That happened in the winter in those mountains. This next one is it's just kind of a sad story. So this particular person is sharing a story of she had lived in a house along the railroad tracks for several years and as an adult. And she said that a couple years prior to this series of events that she's about to explain, one of her friends had left her home one night, and in the morning she found out he had been hit by a train crossing the railroad tracks. And she said, I was always worried because I didn't know if it was an accident or if it was a suicide. And it just always bothered her. And she thought about it every time she would look out the window and see the tracks. So years go by, 3 or 4 years go by. She's got a boyfriend, and he goes out one night to go to the grocery store. It's really late in the evening, and he comes back and he comes in the house and he tells this crazy story that as he was coming back up the driveway, he noticed this guy on the railroad tracks. And he's like, I got out of the car and I was watching him, and he was like pulling at his foot, like his foot was stuck and he couldn't get loose. And he said, in the distance, I could hear the train. And
Mhm.
I was like, holy crap, man, you got to get off that track. And he yelled, are you okay? And the guy just kept pulling at his leg as if he was stuck. And he said, it scared me. And I just took off running, and I literally dove into him, and the force of me hitting him knocked him out of his shoe onto the ground on the other side before the train got through. And he said, as he hit the ground, he disappeared. And this guy's really rattled. He's like, I don't know what the hell I saw. And he's just really scared. And she said, what did he look like? And he began to describe the guy. And it sounded like her friend. But, I mean, if you say things like he was tall and thin, he was wearing blue jeans, that could be 1,000 people, right?
Yeah. Right.
So she gets a photo album out, and she says, is the man in the picture in any of the pictures? And he flips through it and he goes, that man right there. That was her friend who had died on a winter's night 4 years earlier. And she said, I was really rattled. I was scared. I was sad. But there was also a silver lining. I now knew that he died, not because he was a suicide, but that it was an accident. And I could tell his parents that he didn't do this to himself. It was an accident. As sad as it is, it was peace for them. And she thought that that was why he returned, because he had never been seen before, nor was he ever seen since. But it gave the family closure. So it was an interesting story. So I think we've talked about a story, the Palatine Light story, once a long, long time ago. But the story has a lot more to it than I had talked about back then. Back then, I told you the legend. I'm going to tell you the history of this story. This story is actually not of a ship called the Palatine, which is what the legend says. And there's John Whittier wrote a poem called The Palatine, which is about this particular tragedy. And so it became named the Palatine, and everybody believes the ship was the Palatine, but that's not the truth of it. So I wanted to share the real story. So the legend came from an actual shipwreck. There was a ship called the Princess Augusta that had sailed from Rotterdam in 1738 under the Captain George Long. It had 14 crew and 240 immigrants that were Palatine people from Palatine. And they were traveling to the United States to start a new life. That was the goal. It is the middle of winter. It is a rough time to make passage, but they were determined. So along the journey, it was a terrible journey all the way through. Now the plan was for them to travel from Germany, where the Palatines are, to Philadelphia, where they would put in and most likely end up headed to the James River in Virginia, because there were other groups of Palatine people who had settled there already. So that was the idea. There were about 3,000 actually who had a community there, and that's probably where they were headed. However, there was nothing good about this journey. The ship is tossed, high winds, bad seas, illnesses, over 200 of the passengers, and there were 240, so over 200 of the passengers, and half the crew die, along with the captain. Now, the first mate's name is Andrew Brooke, who took over, and there are horrible storms that push the ship off course. They end up spending 3 months on this water in the middle of the winter, in the most bitter cold, and they can't make land anywhere because they can't get the ship to go toward. I cannot imagine. Now they eventually realize that they're near Block Island in Rhode Island, and The idea is going to be that they're going to end up there. At least it's land. They'll figure out what to do from there. Brooke, however, is not a nice man. And the people are starving. The rations, you can imagine, they've been on the sea a month and a half longer than they meant to be. The rations are gone down to nothing. And he's making them pay exorbitant amounts of money just to feed themselves. The story is that during a snowstorm, it wrecked on a place called Sandy Point on the island on December 27th of 1738. There were dispositions and an inquiry made of what happened, and Brooke rowed to shore with the crew, and he left the passengers on board without a boat to get them off. Now, there's some discrepancies at this point. The Block Islanders who testified said that they went out the next day and got the passengers and their possessions, but 20 of those 40 that were left were dead, and they brought them ashore and they were buried. And there's actually a grave marker that the Historical Society on Block Island placed in 1947, and it says the site of the Palatine graves. So we know that part of it's true. But the crew never faced any charges for their actions. And the passengers who made it to land, most of them just sort of faded into nothingness. There's 2 survivors who actually stayed on the island, and most of the accounts indicate that the ship was unsalvageable and was pushed out to sea to sink. However, there are documents that prove that it wasn't just pushed out to sea, that it was pushed out to sea on fire, which is called scuttling. And both in the legal documents and in the lore of the people of Block Island, this is the story. There was a woman who had been driven insane by the suffering that had been going on this journey. She had had a breakdown. And some accounts name her as Mary Vanderline, that when they lifted the people out of the ship, she was still aboard the ship. Nobody noticed, nobody looked for her, and she was still aboard the ship. Now, only 48 hours occurs, and this whole thing takes place in 48 hours. So the ship is on the reef, ruined, and anchored out there, and the crew head for land and leave them to die in this bitter cold. And by the next day, by their account, the local folk go out and get these people. By then, 20 of them have died. So there's about 20 people left. Everybody's just grateful to get out. Nobody took notice of this fact. So when they set the ship ablaze, Mary was still on it. And the story is that she was seen on the deck as the ship was burning, screaming something, nobody knew what. And she just went out to sea, and the ship burned and sunk into the ocean, and along with it her. Now, the story is that on the Saturday between Christmas and New Year's Eve, there are still sporadic accounts. Locals tell you of seeing the burning ship set sail, and they believe it is the ship, which became known as the Palatine because in the documents they just referred to it as the Palatine ship, meaning the ship full of Palatine people. And that's how the name got switched around. But it is, to this day, claimed that from time to time they see it between Christmas and New Year's, out in the ocean, in the distance, late at night. It's kind of hard to miss a ship from the 1700s on fire, floating along. And everybody knows what it is. It is the Palatine. And I just thought it was a really interesting story. There's 2 more stories, and then I'll say goodnight. I think we've had our fill of winter tales, but this one comes from the Labrador, the country of the Labrador. There was a story of a man who was a trapper in the 1700s. This man was not a nice guy. He was a bully, a drunkard, a womanizer. He liked to fight. And so he would go out trapping. He drove a sleigh with 8 pure white huskies. And when he'd get enough skins, he would go to whatever town he was near at that time. He would go into town, sell his skins, get a snootful, start hitting on the local women, sometimes get into some pretty bad brawls, and eventually the local constabulary would put him out of town. And then he would go out, he would do this all over again. And this is the course of his life until he dies. He often would sell alcohol to the native people, and then he would get into a lot of trouble for stuff like that. And eventually, he just disappeared. And eventually, somebody found the remains of his sleigh and him, and the dogs were still tied to it, dead. He had passed away. And this would have been the end of the story, except for the fact that not very long after that, people began to come in out of the wilderness. And Labrador is a very rough, rugged woodland. And in the middle of the winter, it's deep snows and what have you. So people would get lost. And they would talk about this crazy old trapper who drove a sleigh with 8 white huskies, and how this man would come out of the swirling snow and tell them how to get to town, show them the path that they needed to take to not die. But the strangest story was one of a trapper who found himself lost in a horrible blizzard, and he was far from the town he was trying to get to, and he knew he wasn't going to make it. He tried to take shelter to wait out the blizzard, and it became painfully clear to him he was going to freeze to death. Out of nowhere, according to this man, this sleigh, led by the 8 white huskies and this big burly old trapper, comes out of nowhere. And he said that the man picked him up, laid him in amongst the skins on the sleigh, covered him over, and took him to town. Now, this is what makes the story interesting to me. They said the man carried him into the local inn, laid him on a couch, looked at the innkeeper, who was rightfully rattled to see this dude who looks like he came out of an old movie. And the man said he needed help and then disappeared in front of the innkeeper. They say to this day, there are times when this fellow rescues people. They always describe him the same. The huskies are kind of the giveaway. It is believed that he has come back to help people, to atone for whatever it is he had done in his life, because he never did a kind thing while he was alive. One last story. I couldn't pass it up. It is one of the most interesting stories I have read in a while. This story is of a young man. He does not give his name. This would have been during World War II. And he had just graduated from Harvard University in Manhattan. He was a New York Cityite. He loved the city. He loved the hubbub and all of this. It was the middle of World War II. It was raging in Europe. A lot of his friends had left school to join the military, and this is a cold winter's night. He's walking down the street and shivering as he gets to the streetlight at the corner. He notices 2 men in Royal Air Force jackets from, he's seen pictures of them. He knows that's the English uniform. And he's like, they must be here on some sort of military, leave or something like that. So he strikes up a conversation because they're standing there waiting for the light to turn. And in their flipped British accent, they say hello, and they ask this, is this Times Square? The one man says, and he's like, yeah, and he's kind of laughing. It's kind of a touristy question to ask. And he's like, they must be on leave or something. That's got to be the answer. And he said, where are you going? And they said, well, we really don't know. We've never been here before. And he said, well, if you'll let me, I'm going to the club to have dinner. Let me take you to the club, and I'll buy you dinner as a welcome from New York City to all of you. Kind of a deal. Just really gracious. He wanted to hear their stories. He wanted to learn a little more. He was just curious. And they were thrilled. They followed him along the streets. They chatted. He got their names. They got to the club. They sit down. They start to have dinner. The only time the men were squeamish is if he got near the stuff about the war. And he's like, okay, I can see that. Maybe they've had a really bad thing happen and they just don't want to go there. So he just leaves it alone. And he notices they keep checking their watches and he says, are you waiting for something or you got to go somewhere? And they're like, no, 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 we're fine. And they talk all evening, well into the evening. It's getting to midnight and they finally they've been checking their watches the whole time and he's like, well, maybe it's a military thing, like a habit or something. And they say to him about approximately midnight, they said, oh, I'm so sorry, but we really are going to have to leave now. And they stand up, they thank their host, and they say, the tall pilot turned back and he said to him, we've always wanted to be in Times Square, but I never had the opportunity. It's so strange that I had to wait until after we were dead. We were killed in action yesterday. Our planes were shot down over Berlin, but yet I fulfilled my dream. The man stiffened, his eyes widened, and his mouth fell open. And as he was ready to say something, the two pilots faded away in the full view of all of the diners in the restaurant that night. And at that moment, it struck midnight. It's one heck of a little winter story, isn't it?
Yes.
I love that story. I had to share it. It's a really cool story. And with that, I will say, stay warm and good night.